What happens when a Hollywood legend decides she's had enough of being interrupted and talks back to one of daytime television's most outspoken hosts? Well, you're about to witness one of the most brutal verbal takedowns in The View's history, where Jane Fonda absolutely destroyed Joy Behar live on national television. This clash was so intense that it left the entire studio in stunned silence. And by the end, Joy Behar looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear forever. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story is absolutely wild. It started like any other Tuesday morning on The View. The cameras were rolling, the audience was settled in their seats, and the hosts were preparing to welcome their guest for the day, the legendary Jane Fonda. At 86 years old, Fonda had seen it all in Hollywood. From her early days as a rising star to becoming an activist and fitness guru, she had agreed to come on the show to discuss her latest project. But what nobody expected was that Joy Behar would turn the interview into a personal attack session. As Jane Fonda walked onto the set, the audience erupted in applause. She looked elegant in a crisp white blazer, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her posture as confident as ever. She settled into the guest chair with the grace of someone who had been in the spotlight for over 6 decades. "Welcome back to The View, Jane," said Whoopi Goldberg with genuine warmth. "It's always such a pleasure to have you here." "Thank you for having me," Jane replied with a smile. "It's wonderful to be back." But before Jane could even get comfortable, Joy Behar jumped in with her typical lack of subtlety. "So, Jane, I have to ask you about something that's been bothering me. You've been very vocal about climate change and activism, but don't you think it's a bit hypocritical coming from someone who spent decades flying around in private jets and living in massive mansions?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The other hosts exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with Joy's aggressive opening. Jane Fonda's expression shifted slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Well, Joy, I think that's an interesting way to start an interview," Jane said, her voice steady, but with an edge that suggested she wasn't going to be pushed around. "I've been transparent about my past and the changes I've made in my lifestyle. I've reduced my carbon footprint significantly and used my platform to raise awareness about climate issues." Joy wasn't satisfied with that response. She leaned forward in her chair, her voice getting louder. "But come on, Jane. You can't just say you've changed and expect everyone to forget about your lavish lifestyle. You're telling regular people to make sacrifices while you live in luxury. Don't you see the problem with that?" The audience began to murmur, sensing the tension building between the two women. Jane Fonda's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, everyone could see the fire that had made her such a formidable actress and activist. "Joy, I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here," Jane said, her voice calm but firm. "Are you interviewing me about my current work, or are you trying to create drama for your show? Because if it's the latter, I think you're going about it the wrong way." Joy's face flushed red. She clearly hadn't expected Jane to push back so directly. "I'm just asking the questions that viewers want answered. I'm being honest here." Jane red alert. Get her. "I'm being honest here." "No, Joy." Jane interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "You're being rude and confrontational. There's a difference between honest journalism and what you're doing right now." The other hosts sat in stunned silence as the two women faced off. Sunny host looked like she wanted to intervene, while Sarah Haynes fidgeted with her notes. Whoopi Goldberg's expression was unreadable, but her body language suggested she was preparing to step in if things got worse. Joy, feeling cornered, decided to double down. "I'm sorry if you can't handle tough questions, Jane. But this is The View. We don't do softball interviews here." That comment was the spark that ignited Jane Fonda's fury. She sat up straighter in her chair, her eyes blazing with an intensity that reminded everyone why she had been such a commanding presence on screen. "Tough questions." Jane's voice was sharp now, cutting through the air like a blade. "Joy, you call that journalism? You ambushed me with poorly researched accusations without giving me a chance to properly respond. That's not tough journalism. That's tabloid sensationalism." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Jane wasn't finished. "And furthermore, if you had done even basic research before this interview, you would know that I've been living in a smaller home for years. I've eliminated private jet travel from my personal life, and I've donated millions to environmental causes. But you didn't bother to check any of that, did you? The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Joy Behar looked genuinely shocked that Jane Fonda was fighting back so forcefully. She stammered for a moment before trying to regain control of the conversation. Well, I think our viewers deserve to know about these contradictions, Joy said weakly, but her confidence was clearly shaken. Jane leaned back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. What our viewers deserve, Joy, is honest, respectful dialogue, not whatever this performance is supposed to be. The word performance hit Joy like a slap. Her face went from red to pale in seconds, and she looked around the table as if searching for support from her co-hosts. But they all seemed to be avoiding eye contact, leaving her to face Jane Fonda's wrath alone. I don't know what you're implying, Joy said, her voice getting defensive and higher-pitched. I'm not implying anything, Jane replied coolly. I'm stating it directly. You're performing right now trying to create conflict where none needs to exist. It's beneath both of us. Joy Behar was clearly rattled. She had started this interview thinking she could intimidate the Hollywood legend, but instead she was being systematically dismantled by someone who had decades of experience dealing with much tougher opponents than a daytime television host. Look, Jane, Joy tried again. I'm just trying to hold you accountable for your actions. Jane Fonda let out a small laugh that was more condescending than amused. Hold me accountable, Joy. You're a talk show host, not a prosecutor. And even if you were, you'd need to have your facts straight before you started making accusations. The tension in the studio was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of Joy Behar's humiliation as Jane Fonda continued her verbal assault. Whoopi finally decided to step in, sensing that Joy was drowning and the interview was spiraling out of control. Maybe we should move on to talking about your new project, Jane after. But Joy Behar, now thoroughly embarrassed and desperate to save face, made the worst possible decision. Instead of taking the lifeline Whoopi had thrown her, she decided to go even harder. No, wait, Joy said, holding up her hand. I think we need to address this properly, Jane. You've made a career out of being controversial. From your time in Vietnam to your various political stances, you've never shied away from stirring the pot. So, why are you so sensitive now when someone questions you? The audacity of that statement left everyone speechless for a moment. Jane Fonda's expression went from annoyed to genuinely angry. She had been trying to keep things civil, but Joy had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Sensitive. Jane's voice was dangerously quiet now. Joy, you clearly don't understand the difference between being controversial and being ignorant. What you just said proves that you have no idea what you're talking about. Joy, emboldened by what she mistakenly thought was momentum, pressed forward. I'm talking about your anti-war protests, your comments about American soldiers. You can't just rewrite history, Jane. The studio fell dead silent. Even the crew behind the cameras seemed to stop moving. Jane Fonda sat perfectly still for a moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had a steel edge that could have cut glass. Joy, I'm going to give you one chance to retract that statement and apologize, because what you just said is not only factually incorrect. It's deliberately inflammatory and disrespectful to both me and to the veterans I've worked with for decades. But Joy, in her arrogance and desperation, made yet another catastrophic mistake. I don't need to apologize for stating facts. Your actions during Vietnam are well documented. Jane Fonda stood up slowly from her chair, and for a moment, it looked like she might walk off the set entirely. Instead, she turned to face Joy directly. And when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had faced down much more formidable opponents than a talk show host having a public meltdown. Facts. Jane's voice was controlled, but deadly serious. Let me give you some facts.
Joy.
I spent 2 years visiting wounded veterans in hospitals. I've worked with veteran organizations for over 50 years. I've apologized repeatedly for any pain my actions caused. And I've dedicated significant portions of my life to supporting our troops. But you wouldn't know any of that because you didn't bother to research before you opened your mouth. Joy's face was now completely pale. She was realizing that she had stepped into quicksand, but instead of stopping, she kept struggling and making it worse. Well, that may be true, but the perception is still there. Joy stammered. The perception? Jane's eyebrows shot up. Joy, you're not reporting on perception. You're creating it. You're spreading misinformation and then hiding behind the excuse that it's what people think. Sarah Haynes finally found her voice and tried to salvage the situation. Maybe we should take a commercial break. But Jane Fonda held up her hand. No, I think we should finish this conversation.
Joy started it.
So let's see it through. Joy looked like a deer caught in headlights. She had clearly expected Jane to be an easy target, an elderly actress who would crumble under aggressive questioning. Instead, she had awakened a force of nature who is now systematically destroying her credibility in front of millions of viewers. Joy, Jane continued, you have a platform that reaches millions of people every day. With that platform comes responsibility. You can't just throw around accusations and half-truths because you think it makes for good television. I wasn't throwing around accusations, Joy protested weakly. Yes, you were. Jane shot back immediately. From the moment I sat down, you've been making statements without basis, asking loaded questions. And now you're trying to relitigate history that you clearly don't understand. This isn't journalism, Joy. This is a hit job. The other hosts looked mortified. Sunny host was staring at her hands, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the interview had taken. Whoopi looked like she was calculating how to end this disaster, while Sarah seemed to be in shock. Joy, now completely out of her depth, made one final desperate attempt to regain control. I think you're overreacting, Jane. This is just a normal interview. That comment was the final straw. Jane Fonda let out a laugh that was pure disbelief. Normal? Jane shook her head.
Joy.
In a normal interview, the host prepares by researching their guest. They ask thoughtful questions designed to inform their audience. They listen to the answers and follow up appropriately. You've done none of that. I did prepare, Joy said defensively. No, you didn't, Jane replied firmly. If you had prepared, you would know that I've spent the last decade working on climate documentaries, that I've been arrested multiple times for protesting environmental destruction, that I've put my money where my mouth is by funding renewable energy projects. But instead of asking me about any of that meaningful work, you chose to ambush me with tabloid-level gossip. Joy's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She had no response because Jane Fonda was absolutely right, and everyone in the studio knew it. And another thing, Jane continued, her voice gaining momentum. Your approach isn't just unprofessional, it's lazy. You could have had a fascinating conversation about the intersection of entertainment and activism, about how Hollywood has changed over the decades, about the challenges facing older women in the industry. Instead, you chose to create fake controversy because you think conflict equals good television. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Some were nodding in agreement with Jane, while others looked uncomfortable witnessing such a thorough, professional dismantling. Joy finally managed to find her voice again, but it came out as barely more than a whisper.
No.
Joy, Jane said, sitting back down, but maintaining her intense eye contact. You were trying to score cheap points at my expense. There's a huge difference. The weight of Jane Fonda's words settled over the studio like a heavy blanket. Joy Behar looked smaller somehow, deflated and defeated. She had started this interview thinking she was going to expose hypocrisy, and instead had exposed her own lack of preparation and professionalism. Furthermore, Jane continued, clearly not finished with her devastating critique. The way you've conducted this interview says more about you than it does about me. You've shown your viewers that you're more interested in creating drama than in having meaningful conversations with your guests. Joy tried one more time to defend herself. Jane tilted her head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to be both elegant and condescending. Joy, there's a difference between tough questions and rude behavior. Tough questions are well-researched, relevant, and asked with respect. What you've been doing is just being combative for the sake of being combative. The silence that followed Jane's words was deafening. Joy Behar sat frozen, clearly struggling to process the fact that she had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by her guest. But Jane Fonda wasn't finished. She had decades of experience dealing with hostile interviews, difficult directors, and challenging situations. And she was about to use every bit of that experience to deliver a final blow that would end this confrontation once and for all. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Joy?" Jane said, her voice now calm, but still carrying that underlying steel. "You had an opportunity to have a real conversation with someone who has lived through 7 decades of American history, who has seen the entertainment industry evolve, who has been on the front lines of social movements. Instead, you chose to waste everyone's time with this performance." Joy's face was now completely drained of color. She looked around the table desperately, but her co-hosts were all avoiding eye contact. They had clearly decided that Joy had dug this hole herself, and they weren't going to jump in to help her. "I think maybe we should move on," Joy said quietly, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Oh, now you want to move on?" Jane's eyebrow arched perfectly. "After you've spent the last 10 minutes making accusations and spreading misinformation, now you want to change the subject. That's very convenient, Joy." The audience was riveted. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. This was a masterclass in how to handle a hostile interviewer. Jane Fonda was systematically dismantling everything Joy Behar had tried to accomplish. And she was doing it with the grace and precision of someone who had been in far more challenging situations than this. "Joy, let me ask you something," Jane continued, leaning forward slightly. "When you were preparing for this interview, what exactly did you hope to accomplish? Did you think you were going to expose some great hypocrisy? Did you think I would crumble under your questioning? What was your endgame here?" Joy opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was completely speechless, trapped by Jane's direct questioning with no way to escape, without admitting that her entire approach had been wrong from the start. "Because from where I'm sitting," Jane went on, "it looks like you invited me on your show not to have a conversation, but to use me as a prop in whatever narrative you had already decided to tell your viewers. That's not journalism, Joy. That's exploitation." The word exploitation hung in the air like a bomb. Joy's hands were visibly shaking now as she tried to figure out how to respond to such a direct and devastating accusation. "I never intended to. I mean," Joy stammered. But Jane cut her off with a gentle but firm gesture. "Joy, I want you to listen to me very carefully," Jane said, her voice taking on an almost maternal tone that somehow made her words even more cutting. "I've been doing interviews for over 60 years. I've faced hostile journalists, aggressive prosecutors, angry protesters, and hostile studio executives. You're none of those things. You're just a talk show host who thought she could score points by being rude to an elderly guest. And that's not just unprofessional, it's sad." The audience gasped audibly at Jane's use of the word sad. It was delivered with such quiet authority that it hit harder than any shouting could have. Joy looked like she had been physically struck. Whoopi finally decided she had to intervene before things got even worse for Joy. "Jane, we really appreciate you being here, and I think maybe we should wrap up this segment." But Jane held up her hand politely. "Actually, Whoopi, I'd like to finish this thought if I may. Joy started this conversation, and I think she deserves to hear my complete response." Joy looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair, but Jane wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. "Joy, you mentioned earlier that I've been controversial throughout my career. You're absolutely right about that. But there's a crucial difference between being controversial because you're fighting for something you believe in and being controversial because you don't know how to conduct yourself professionally." Jane paused for a moment, letting that distinction sink in before continuing. "When I protested the Vietnam War, when I spoke out about women's rights, when I fought for environmental causes, I knew I would face criticism. I was prepared for it because I believed in what I was doing. But what you've done today isn't brave or principled. You've just been rude for no reason other than you thought it would make for entertaining television." Joy finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm sorry if you feel I was rude." "I don't feel you were rude, Joy," Jane replied immediately. "You were rude? That's not a feeling. That's a fact. And your apology would be more meaningful if you actually understood what you're apologizing for." The other hosts exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with how thoroughly Joy was being demolished, but none of them seemed willing or able to step in and help her. Let me give you some advice. Jane continued, her voice now taking on the tone of a teacher, addressing a student who had badly misbehaved. The next time you have a guest on this show, try treating them with respect. Try asking questions that are designed to inform your audience rather than to create conflict. Try listening to their answers instead of waiting for your next opportunity to attack. Joy nodded mutely, clearly hoping that agreeing would make this nightmare end sooner. And most importantly, Jane said, her voice gaining strength for her final point. Remember that your guests are human beings, not punching bags for whatever frustrations you're carrying around. We come on shows like this to have conversations, to share our experiences, to connect with audiences. We don't come here to be ambushed by hosts who haven't done their homework. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible. Jane Fonda sat back in her chair, having delivered one of the most thorough and devastating takedowns in daytime television history. Joy Behar looked absolutely destroyed. Her earlier confidence replaced by humiliation and regret. Now, Jane said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes, would you like to ask me about my actual work, or should I assume this interview is over? 2000. Joy looked around the table desperately, but found no help from her co-hosts. Whoopi was staring at her hands. Sunny was looking at the ceiling, and Sarah was furiously scribbling notes that she probably wasn't actually reading. I think we should go to commercial. Joy finally managed to say. Jane Fonda stood up gracefully, smoothing down her blazer. That's probably for the best. Thank you for having me, and I hope you'll consider what I've said today. As the cameras cut away and the studio lights dimmed, Joy Behar sat alone at the table looking like she had been hit by a truck. She had started this interview thinking she would expose Jane Fonda, but instead she had exposed herself as unprepared, unprofessional, and completely out of her depth when faced with a true Hollywood legend who refused to be intimidated. The audience filed out in stunned silence, many of them shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. It was clear that this would go down as one of the most brutal interview disasters in television history. And Joy Behar would be the one remembered as the host who got absolutely destroyed by an 86-year-old actress who refused to take her nonsense. What did you think of this absolutely brutal takedown? Have you ever seen a guest completely destroy a host like this before? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more incredible moments like this.